Welcome to Algebra 2, Unit 7, Lesson 11 Practice Problems. This lesson has only one vocabulary term, and again, that is margin of error. Remember that the margin of error is the maximum expected difference between an estimate for a population characteristic and the actual value of the population characteristic. Your margin of error is 2 standard deviations above the mean to 2 standard deviations below the mean. Our first question says, Han and Priya are studying the size of trees in the forest next to their school. They each take a random sample to find the proportion of trees that have a trunk circumference greater than 4 feet. Tyler's sample contains 12 trees, and Priya's sample contains 20 trees. After collecting data, they run 100 simulations each to determine an estimate for the proportion of trees with a large trunk circumference. How do you think Tyler's reported margin of error compares to Priya's? Explain your reasoning. So the main point that we need to understand here is larger sample sizes have smaller margins of error. And the opposite is also true. Smaller sample sizes have larger margins of error. So this means Priya's margin of error will be smaller because her sample size is larger. 20 is greater than 12. If you have any questions about how sample size relates to margin of error size, please ask for clarification now so that you are set up for success moving forward onto other practice problems. Two reporters are both interested in finding the proportion of people in town who are unemployed. They each collect a random sample and use the proportion of unemployed people in the sample to run 100 simulations to determine a margin of error. The first reporter claims the proportion of unemployed people in town is 0.045 with a margin of error of 0.011. The second reporter claims that the proportion of unemployed people in town is 0.037 with a margin of error of 0.02. Number 1, why do you think the estimated proportion of unemployed people in town is different for the two reporters? So the reporters probably interviewed different people. This would cause a difference in the mean result. For number 2, why do you think the margin of error is different for the two reporters? The first reporter probably interviewed more people, giving them a smaller margin of error. If you have any questions about what might lead to variability in results, or any questions about how sample size affects the size of your margin of error, please ask for clarification so that you can be set up for success as we continue to move on to other practice problems. An advertising agency uses a random sample of 100 television viewers in simulations to estimate the proportion of people who skip commercials when watching television is 0.653 with a margin of error of 0.082. They decide to check their results by collecting another random sample with 200 television viewers. Which of the results is most likely to be the estimates from the second random sample of simulations? So, double the viewers should result in a smaller margin of error. The proportion should be similar. So as we look through these, first we know we should get a smaller margin of error. If our margin of error was 0.082, then we know that our new margin of error could not be larger. So B is not correct. Then we know that the proportion should be similar. And the most similar to 0.653 is 0.664. So the proportion is similar and the margin of error is slightly lower. With D, the proportion is farther away and the margin of error is much smaller. And with A, the proportion is farther away and the margin of error is much smaller. What we would expect to see is a small change in both, so C is the most likely outcome. If you have any questions about how the number of sample participants affects the proportion or the margin of error, please ask for clarification so that you are set up for success moving forward on future practice problems. The last practice problem on lesson 11 says a scientist uses a random sample of 30 electric companies and simulations from the sample to find that the proportion of electricity produced from renewable methods in the United States is 0.14 with a margin of error of 0.025. Which of these methods would be most likely to significantly reduce the margin of error? So if I want to reduce the margin of error, I need to increase the sample size. So if we go through these choices, running more simulations will not necessarily reduce the margin of error. So it's not A. Collecting another sample using different electric companies could give you entirely different data. It might raise the margin of error. We just don't know. So it's not B. C, collect another sample using fewer electric companies would actually have the opposite effect. The smaller your sample size, the bigger your margin of error. So it's not C. D is the only one that's correct. If you collect another sample using more electric companies, a larger sample size will reduce your margin of error. If you have any questions about how sample size affects the margin of error, please get clarification on this so that you can be set up for success as we move on to lesson 12 practice problems.